Today, we're jumping back in time to 1066. Now, this was one of the most important years in English history, a real moment of crisis where the entire fate of the country was just hanging in the balance. Why? Because a massive invasion was coming. Let's get right into it. So, picture this. It's late summer, 1066, and this is the sight that greets people on the coast of northern England. A massive fleet of Viking longships packed with warriors has just landed. And they're not here for a quick raid. Nope, they're here to take over, led by a really fearsome Viking king. I mean, when you look at the sheer size of this invasion force, you've got to ask yourself, who could possibly stand in their way? For England, things were looking really bleak. So let's break down exactly what England was up against. This wasn't just a raiding party. Oh no, this was a full-scale, well-planned invasion ready for a major war. Everything really kicks off on September 18th, 1066. That's the day the Vikings make landfall, and their campaign to conquer the whole of England officially begins. The scale of this thing was just enormous. We're talking 300 ships. Can you even imagine that many ships appearing on the horizon all at once? It was a crystal clear sign of how serious this invasion was. And on board all those ships, around 10,000 warriors. A huge battle-hardened army ready to fight for the English crown. Now, who was leading this army is super important. First, you've got Harald Hardrada, the terrifying king of Norway. But he wasn't alone. He teamed up with a guy named Tostig Godwinson, who, and you won't believe this, was the English king's own brother. A powerful English nobleman fighting with the invaders. Talk about family drama. So, with a huge force and these two determined leaders, the Vikings started making moves, and fast. At first, it really seemed like they were completely unbeatable. In fact, just 2 days after they landed, on September 20th, they ran into an English army at a place called Fulford. And guess what? The Vikings won. It was their first real test, and it was a massive victory for them. After that big win, the Vikings marched on the most important city in the north, York. And the city pretty much surrendered right away. For Harald Hardrada and his army, it must have felt like the whole thing was almost over. They'd won a huge battle and taken the capital of the north. Easy, right? And so, they started to relax. They set up their camp near a place called Stamford Bridge and began to celebrate their big win. It was a warm day, so a lot of them even took off their heavy armor. They were feeling confident, over the moon, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen. You see, while the Vikings were partying, the English king had heard all about the invasion, and he was making a move. He was getting ready to throw a surprise party of his own. The Vikings felt totally safe. They thought the main English army was hundreds of miles away, down south, waiting for a different invasion. And that was a huge, fatal mistake. Because King Harald Godwinson, Tostig's brother, had gathered his best soldiers, his housecarls, and was literally racing north to face them. He was not about to let his kingdom go without a fight. His army had to cover an incredible distance, over 300 kilometers, or about 185 miles. That is a very long way for an entire army to march. And they did it in only 4 days. That's an absolutely astonishing speed for that time. This crazy fast march across the country was a masterstroke, and it meant they were going to have the element of complete and total surprise. So, on September 25th, King Harold's army arrived at Stamford Bridge, and they found the entire Viking army completely off guard. This really tells the whole story, doesn't it? On one side, you've got the Vikings, just chilling out in the sun. On the other, the image of what they suddenly saw, King Harold's army in full battle gear, charging right at them. The shock must have been unbelievable. The English army charged forward. Now, a key part of the battlefield was a narrow bridge that the English had to get across. The Vikings desperately scrambled to form their famous shield wall to defend themselves. The fighting was brutal, and it went on for hours. But in the end, both of the invading leaders, Harald Hardrada and Tostig, were killed in the chaos. With their leaders gone, the Viking shield wall finally cracked. And once that defensive line collapsed, the battle was pretty much decided. The English army just poured through the gap and completely overwhelmed the rest of the invaders. The English didn't just win. This was a complete and utter victory.
The great Viking army that had landed just a week earlier was almost totally wiped out. And this right here shows you just how total that victory was. The Vikings showed up with a fleet of 300 ships. After the battle, they only needed 25 to carry the few survivors home. That's a staggering defeat. But, even after such a bloody battle, King Harold actually showed some mercy. This quote from a history book written at the time called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle tells us that Harold let the Viking king's son, Olaf, and the other survivors go home in peace.
So, King Harold had pulled off an absolutely incredible victory. He smashed one of the last great Viking armies, and he saved his kingdom. This battle is often seen as the very end of the Viking Age in England. But, and this is what makes 1066 so famous, just as Harold's exhausted army was celebrating, another invasion force was landing on the south coast. The fight for England was far from over.